So welcome. Um, my name is John Beebe, and I lead the Democratic Engagement Exchange here in the Faculty of Arts at Toronto Metropolitan University. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the land that I have the privilege to call home is sacred land. My journey to this place began when my ancestors settled here in what is now called New York, and continued when I settled in this part of Turtle Island 16 years ago. This land that I now call home has been the site of human activity for 15,000 years. This land is the territory of the Haudenosaunee nations, such as the Huron-Wendat, the Petun, and the Seneca, as well as the Anishinaabe, and most recently visited by Mississaugas of the Credit. The territory later became the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe to peacefully share and care for the resources and relationships around the Great Lakes. And as we begin this summit, it is important to acknowledge that the principles of democratic governance are not something that arrived here with European settlers. These principles have been a core element of governance for many Indigenous peoples for generations and remain so today. So we are all fortunate to be able to learn from this collected wisdom. Building a vibrant and inclusive democracy takes time and resources, and none of this would be possible without the generous support of Elections Canada, the Faculty of Arts at TMU, Elections BC, Elections Ontario, Apathy is Boring, the Jaroslawski Chair in Democracy, the Consortium on Electoral Democracy, Université Laval, and Argyle Communications. So a little round of applause for all those folks who made this happen. The inspiration and hard work of our advisory committee is responsible for many of the sessions you will attend. In addition to our supporters, this includes the Samara Center for Democracy, the Institute for Canadian Citizenship, the Ontario Nonprofit Network, and our own TMU Professor Michael McGregor. And I also want to say thanks to a partnership with Hot Docs. We have a special treat for you. During the breaks, we'll be screening the Citizen Minutes series, showcasing citizen change makers in the auditorium right here. So if you're a little networked out, you can hang out here and see short docs. They're about 8 to 10 minutes each. They're really quite inspiring. Before I turn it over to Dean Sugerman for a few welcoming remarks and Farah Nasser, who will be our host, I want to thank all of you for being here. And as we like to say, for engaging democracy on an early Monday morning. We are doing something that's never been done before. We are bringing together leaders from three sectors, the public service, academia, and civil society, to better understand and address the challenges facing our democracy. And if you don't happen to speak fluent election management and don't know the difference between a crow, an RO, and a flow, or your eyes glazed over when your professor started talking about statistical significance in college, or you never have been clear about the difference between a nonprofit and a charity, don't worry. We have simultaneous translation. All right, I'm very glad you laughed. In addition to bridging sectors that speak different languages, what we are doing is unprecedented in ways that go beyond what will happen these next 2 days. Because Canadian democracy is unprecedented. And I say that as someone who is proud of my American heritage. But never before in history has such a diverse country established a representative democracy with so few barriers to the most fundamental activity, voting. Unfortunately, that alone is no guarantee that we will continue to have a vibrant and inclusive democracy. And that is why we are here today. Democracy is how we make decisions together. It is an imperfect system that can be frustratingly slow. It also has one superpower that no other system of government has: the ability to correct its own mistakes. But that is only possible if we engage democracy, we ensure that its foundations are healthy and its institutions have earned trust of the people. And there are forces, both domestic and international, that are actively trying to erode that trust. It is the responsibility of those of us here to understand these forces and to counter them. I have been reading Braiding Sweetgrass. There is so much wisdom in the indigenous communities who've lived here for generations before colonial settlers arrived. For example, the concept of braiding sweetgrass itself, the strength that comes when you braid grasses together. A single blade of grass is weak, but when braided together, they gain strength. And then in the hands of a talented craftsperson, it creates baskets of great beauty and utility. Over the next 2 days, I hope we can weave together the different strands that each of us bring to this work. You will hear from panelists and keynotes speakers with decades of experience, insights, and wisdoms to offer from all across Canada. But I also hope you will find the time to talk with and listen to the participants who are here but may not be speaking from the stage. For this work starts with listening. I was powerfully reminded of the importance of listening 10 years ago at North York Community House when I ran my first Democracy Talks volunteer training program. We were in a tiny windowless room, nothing like this room, with 13 secondhand chairs sitting around a donated table. Everyone around the table was born in a different country. I thought, this is why I love Toronto. We started with an icebreaker, asking everyone to share who they would choose as leader of Canada. People said Nelson Mandela, Prime Minister at that time, or Pierre Trudeau, their mother. The last person to speak was a soft-spoken, gracious man from China. And he said, I grew up in a country with strong leaders. And that did not work out so well. So I am not going to choose a leader. I'm going to choose a system. And I choose democracy. That experience sticks with me to this day because it reminds me that when we take the time to listen deeply to people in our community, there is deep wisdom there. And so in that spirit, I hope that we go forward with this session because at the heart of democracy is listening. Thank you very much. And with that, I would like to welcome up Dean Sugerman, who is key to bringing a commitment to democracy to Toronto Metropolitan University, and it's key to bringing me and the work of the Democratic Exchange here. And so for her, I am eternally grateful. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, John. And I'm very glad that you did join us here. So you've done so much since joining TMU. Good morning, everyone. And on behalf of the Faculty of Arts at Toronto Metropolitan University, it's my pleasure. I'm sorry, I think I'm hidden by the tree, but I need the table as well. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Canadian Vote Summit 2023. In nations across the world, and certainly here at home, democracy seemingly hangs in the balance. Cynicism towards democratic process, polarizing viewpoints, often in the absence of serious, grounded dialogue, the rise of populism, anti-intellectualism, and persisting social inequalities characterize our current society. And in the face of these challenges, it is essential to remember that while precarious, democracy, as John alluded to, is also dynamic and resilient. And it's a system that can evolve, it can re-inspire, re-engage, and further the goals of representation, equity, social justice, and human dignity. And we in the Faculty of Arts believe that universities are not immune to or detached from the political, social, and economic developments of the day. Indeed, we have a responsibility to uphold democratic processes and democratic dialogue. After all, universities themselves are crucial democratic institutions. The Faculty of Arts is committed to a range of initiatives that engage our communities both on and off campus and fuel conversations about the challenges facing our democracy. Importantly, we promote practical solutions to democratic backsliding. And at the same time, we try to unpack the often diverse meanings that democracy has for different groups, the different groups of people who make up our university, our community, indeed our society. And let me highlight just a few, and I promise just a few because it is a packed agenda of the projects that center democracy and democratic engagement on campus. One initiative is some of you may be familiar with On the Front Lines of Democracy, and this is a speaker series and podcast led by Jaroslawski Democracy Chair Dr. Sanjay Ruparelia. As part of this series, Dr. Ruparelia engages scholars, thought leaders, community activists, advocates in a dialogue about critical issues facing democracies globally. And Dr. Ruparelia's specialization is India and China. Our Institute for Future Legislators, soon to be renamed, is a program that is open to both students and community members and provides participants with an opportunity to work alongside current and former politicians and journalists. And the goal is to prepare emerging leaders, whether or not they ultimately pursue political office, to make a meaningful impact in their communities. And students of the Institute explore not only how governments function currently, but also how governments can function and who can make up a government, a legislature. For young people, immigrants to Canada, First Nations, many racialized people, and TS LGBTQ+, the Institute inspires participants to see their potential as leaders and advocates in government, in education, in labor, nonprofits, or in any path they choose. And the faculty, and you are familiar with this, is also home to the Democratic Engagement Exchange, host of this event, and led by John Beebe. The exchange partners with academic researchers, community organizations, and multiple levels of government to heighten the democratic participation of the diverse groups of people who make up this country. The exchange's flagship program, Democracy Talks, supports newcomer groups and others who have come up against barriers to full and meaningful democratic participation in Canada. Excuse me. Likewise, our Vote Pop-Up initiative provides a toolkit of resources to help demystify elections. And most recently, the exchange, in partnership with the United Way and the Toronto Star, brought a mayoral debate to the TMU campus. So I highlight these initiatives, and I know it sounds like boasting, but I highlight these initiatives because they underscore, to repeat, my firm belief that it is the responsibility of universities to promote democratic dialogue. In my view, it is critical for young people in particular to understand the workings of our democratic institutions and to engage in democracy in new and unconventional, if not somewhat radical ways. Young people have demonstrated to us that they are passionate about and engaged in a range of social issues. And we saw this firsthand when we asked students what issues matter most to them prior to the upcoming mayoral election in Toronto. Housing affordability, community safety, quality of transit, and a livable wage were among the most cited concerns among TMU students. So over the next 2 days, you will hear from scholars, policymakers, community leaders, journalists, and philanthropic leaders from across the country. And we hope to break through silos, enrich and nuance our understanding of the challenges faced by Canada's democratic system, and to develop, importantly, actionable strategies that will help pave the way for a stronger, more inclusive, and resilient democracy. So thank you in advance to all of the speakers, panelists, and attendees for being here to contribute your voice to these crucial conversations. Thank you very much.
All right. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce our host for the next 2 days, Farah Nasser. Farah is an award-winning journalist and anchor of Global's flagship national evening newscast on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, as well as many Global specials. With over 2 decades of experience, she has reported on major events around the world, including the death of Queen Elizabeth, the inauguration of Joe Biden, the terror attack in London, Ontario, and in here in Toronto. She was the first journalist granted a one-on-one interview with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau after the country was reopening of the pandemic. And she's a trailblazer, and being one of Canada's first journalists to challenge the status quo in her reporting on race and equity and spearheading the global news series hashtag first time I was called, the television special Living in Color, Being Black in Canada, which won the Edward R. Murrow Award. She's also a graduate of TMU. And one of the things that I admire and am so grateful for Farah's involvement in this work is she, like many great journalists, is a brilliant listener, which is core, as I mentioned, to our work. And so with no further ado, I would turn it over to Farah. Thank you.
So much, John. Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I really appreciate that. You know, it almost seems surreal that something that we've come to expect and we've taken for granted is cracking in some countries. As a journalist, you know, we're not just purveyors of the truth. We are purveyors of the news, I should say. We're guardians of the truth. We're watchdogs for power. We're catalysts for change. And in an era where the very foundation of trust and of truth is being tested, in my opinion, the role of the media has never been more critical. We find ourselves in an age of information overload, where news is spreading like wildfire, where lines between fact and fiction are becoming increasingly blurred. And in this time, it's our responsibility as journalists to navigate this treacherous landscape and to separate fact from fiction and provide citizens with accurate and unbiased information to help them make informed decisions. That's the reason I got into news. That's the reason I became a journalist. A free and independent press is not a luxury, it is a necessity for a thriving democracy. I sit on the board of the Canadian Journalism Foundation, and our motto is, as journalism goes, so goes democracy. And that's why I'm here today. And that's why I'm so honored to be speaking with you and being part of this very important event, this first of its kind event. Now, right now in the media, the challenges are numerous and they're formidable. The rise of misinformation and disinformation have eroded trust, have sowed divisions. People are in echo chambers and they're listening not to understand, they're listening to respond. And we've seen the rise of that over the past several years now. We've also seen technology change the landscape when it comes to information. I interviewed Yoshua Bengio. He is, along with Jeffrey Hinton, he's one of the godfathers of AI based in Montreal. And a few days ago, he was telling me about one of his biggest concerns with AI is the idea of human counterfeiting and what that will do to eroding our democracy, to misinformation. And we've already seen this take place. I was telling a story to some of my fellow panelists, not a story, a real life example of how this is already happening in elections. South of the border, as soon as Joe Biden announced his candidacy to become president again, just within hours, the Republican Party used AI to create a fake ad. Well, not a fake ad. It was actually real images. And in this ad, it showed Taiwan being blown up. It showed military on the streets of San Francisco. And in the corner of that ad, it said, these are real images, but they're created with AI. And a reporter from CNN took these images to the streets of Washington, D.C. and spoke to tourists and people in the government and just people on the streets there. And
everyone this reporter spoke to thought that this was really happening, and we're actually wondering, wait, did I miss that on the news? Did that happen under Joe Biden's watch? So even though it was said that it was AI, people were confused, and it showed this dystopian reality, but it was not happening, and people thought it was happening. So you can see the dangers, and we have the 2024 election in the United States coming, and it's going to be a real concern then, technology. And that's why I think our role as journalists to separate fact from fiction is so important. But it also sadly comes at a time when our industry is facing economic pressures. Just last week, some of the best journalists in the country at CTV, our competitor, were laid off. Bureaus were being closed. So it's getting harder and harder to invest in investigative journalism and to do that work of separating fact from fiction. And that's why I'm concerned about the future, but I do also stand in front of you today with hope and with determination. We have so many stakeholders here, and I really hope over the next few days we take into account the most important stakeholder in this equation, which is our citizens, our citizenry. An informed citizenry is the lifeblood of any democracy. So with that, I'm very pleased to start off our first session. We have three leaders here who are deeply committed to understanding the state of electoral democracy in Canada, and each represents a different sector: public service, academia, and civil society. And I'd like to call them up on stage, and they are going to come up on stage, and then each one is going to present an opening statement, and then we'll have more fulsome discussion a little bit after that. So please welcome to the stage Stéphane Perreault, the Chief Electoral Officer of Elections Canada. Round of applause. Great. It's an honor to have you, Stéphane, with us today. Pamela Upal, Director of Public Policy at the Ontario Nonprofit Network, who I've just come to know and is very passionate about her work. So you'll enjoy hearing from her. And we have Alison Harel, professor at Université de Québec at Montréal, with us as well today, who's going to be part of this discussion. So Stéphane, if we could start with you with your opening remarks, and then we'll go down the row. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. It's great to see so many people here on this important topic. We'll be talking, of course, about trust and electoral democracy. Now, trust is a bit of a mysterious thing. It's intangible, and if you ask anyone readily to define trust, they probably would struggle with that definition. Yet it's something that is immediately familiar to us. We require trust to function on our daily lives. Does that work? Okay, sorry, thank you. Trust is about reliability. Trust is grounded in experience, probably more than knowledge, though I'll come back on the issue of how knowledge and understanding can influence trust. Deep trust is a confidence so deeply embedded in us, so hardwired that we don't even realize it. When I drive down the highway at 100 kilometers, sometimes more, and I see the curve coming, I have no doubt that when I turn my steering wheel, the car will follow. And I know nothing about physics, even the very basics of physics, and I know nothing about how my power steering works. I just know that it does. It's always worked, and it always will. Trust is freedom from doubt. Now, that can be a dangerous thing, and we'll talk about that over the next couple of days. Trust is also about relinquishing our own judgment. I trust you to do the right thing. I trust my accountant to do my taxes. I trust my staff to do all kinds of tasks that I don't have the time or the skill set to perform. Now, freedom from doubt and relinquishing our own judgment feeds right into the polarization trap. I believe everything and anything that my partisan side will tell me. But trust is also important, at least a healthy amount of trust is also important in order for us to function. And that's certainly the case regarding the electoral process. There is, of course, a very fundamental connection between trust and democracy. The purpose of an election is to provide legitimacy to the governing authorities. Parliament is legitimate because it was elected. The government is legitimate because it has the support of an elected parliament. If Canadians no longer trust the electoral process, the whole thing crumbles. Now, elections management bodies are an institutional response to the problem of trust. Elections Canada was established in 1920, just over 100 years ago, because it was believed smartly that entrusting the delivery of elections to an independent body would enhance trust in the elections. And for pretty much 100 years, that institutional response to the question of trust was a perfectly sufficient and adequate response. That is no longer the case. Trust has to be earned. The challenge is that we are now facing a broad decline in trust in our institutions. The decline is not a new phenomenon. It is not unique to Canada, and it's certainly not specific to the electoral process. It's also worth pointing out that it did not begin with social media, although certainly social media can contribute to polarization and to distrust. Pew surveys in the US show that trust that the government would do the right thing for them was very high after the war, and then quickly began to decline. It went below 50% in 1972, well before social media, under the Nixon administration, and has kept declining ever since, except for 2 months after 9/11. And it's now around 20%. The decline in trust in institutions in Canada has perhaps been less dramatic, but it has begun, and it has begun well before social media. World Values Survey show that it began in the 1980s. Now, the good news is that trust in elections and trust in elections managed bodies remain high. At the federal level in 2021, 90% of electors, not just voters, thought that Elections Canada had run the election fairly, and they trusted the accuracy of the election results. The percentage was 91% in 2019, so that's very consistent. Overall, 96% of electors, despite the pandemic, found it easy to vote, and 97% of electors with this disability found it easy to vote. That contributes to trust. What's quite interesting is that in 2019 and 2021, and we don't have earlier data on this, but that the trust in election was greater after the event than before. So we measured trust before the election, we measured trust right after it, and it grew. Similarly, but not surprisingly, knowledge about the electoral process grew between before the election, during, and after the election. So there seems to be a correlation between increased knowledge, familiarity with the process, and trust. And that's not something that I came up with. Academics have been saying that for a long time, but our data certainly supports that view. There are also indicators, unfortunately, that this trust is beginning to decline. It's a bit early, and we have some data over the last 3 years, but it is showing cracks in the trust that Canadians have in our electoral process. So we have to be concerned about that. So what can we do, and what can election management bodies do to shore up trust in the electoral process? Knowing that the declining trust is something that is a long-term trend, and it's observed not just in Canada and the US, but also in Europe, means that it would be naive to think that this is something that we can resolve quickly, and certainly not on our own. But understanding how trust works helps to understand how it can be increased. I'll just mention 3 things briefly. The first thing is informing electors and creating familiarity with the process. The evidence, as I said, shows that electors who are informed and familiar about the voting process tend to trust it more. That speaks to the importance not just of voting information campaigns during the election, but civic education more broadly, and opportunities for new electors to become familiar with the voting experience. And that's why I strongly believe in the importance of programs like Student Vote, like the Vote Pop-Up, like Inspire Democracy, that allows us to leverage stakeholder community networks across the country and better reach out to voter communities. So that's the first thing. The second thing is providing a positive and reliable voter experience. This is the basic stuff, but it is critical. It includes the absence of barriers to voting, as well as things now like cybersecurity and rapid election results. It also includes adapting to the changing expectations of Canadians. I know we'll hear later about modernization. Trust includes adapting to those changing expectations. The last point, and I think an important one, is increasing transparency and demonstrating how electoral integrity is ensured. Now, that's not something that we've been very good at or that we've been doing a lot of over the years, but that is something that increasingly we have to do. We just can't tell electors, just trust us. We have to earn that trust by demonstrating how we safeguard the electoral process. So I think we have to be much more deliberate than we have been in the past about showing how our mechanics are, how the controls are in place to safeguard the electoral process. And that's something that we began to do in the last election with postal voting, with the concerns around the integrity of vote by mail. And we put out a lot of information on the controls in place to safeguard that. And for the most part, that worked quite well. But I think that is something that we have to do a lot more in the future. So I'll stop here just to conclude by saying that building and protecting trust in the electoral process is not something that we can simply do by ourselves. We need to work with academics. We need to work with media organizations, with educators, and with civil society groups. So I'm really grateful for this event, and I hope that we'll have a very engaging 2 days.
Good morning, everyone. I have a couple of slides for us today. My name is Pamela Upal, as Farah shared, and I'm the Director of Policy at the Ontario Nonprofit Network. In my sort of opening statement, I wanted to paint a picture of who nonprofits and charities are in Ontario and Canada and sort of set the stage for why we're part of this conversation. So the Ontario Nonprofit Network, or ONN for short, is an independent network for about 58,000 nonprofits and charities in Ontario. We focus on policy, advocacy, and services to strengthen the sector as a key pillar of our society and economy. We work to create a public policy environment that allows nonprofits to thrive. We do this by engaging our network of diverse nonprofits to work together on issues impacting the sector and channeling our voices to government, funders, and other stakeholders. Our sector has never been more critical for Ontarians. Nonprofits are getting people back to work, serving on the front lines, and providing critical care services for the old, young, sick, and frail. Youth employment training services, Meals on Wheels, home care, and gender-based violence services are all nonprofit driven. As demand rises, we're filling gaps for affordable housing, mental health and addictions programs, and settlement services. Our local theaters and festivals, minor soccer leagues, day camps, and places of worship are bringing communities back to life after COVID-19. We weave together critical infrastructure that everyone in Ontario and Canada rely on and is necessary to unlock the full potential of our province's economy. From Thunder Bay to Barrie, Windsor to London, and across the GTA to Ottawa, the nonprofit sector is a significant job creator, a strong enabler of volunteer engagement, and a critical program and services delivery partner to government. We drive community well-being in local communities. We're economic amplifiers. We receive less than half of our revenues from government and reinvest all surpluses back into our missions. We leverage government revenues through private grants and donations, sales of goods and services, and volunteer efforts to create additional value for communities we serve. Just to give you a quick snapshot, with $1 of investment, we generate up to $2.18 in GDP impact. We play a critical role in democracy as well. We play a vital role in fostering an inclusive democracy. We're the bridge between our communities and government. Nonprofits engage and amplify community voices, provide unique public policy insight, and hold governments and decision makers accountable. We're well positioned to mobilize for an inclusive democracy, particularly our Black-led, Indigenous-led, ethno-specific, immigrant-serving, people with disabilities serving organizations. They know what's happening on the ground, have strong local infrastructures, and are trusted leaders in communities. An example of this was the pandemic. Nonprofits were critical in driving vaccinations in communities, providing support, and as a result, we help nonprofits thrive. Governments can be effective and communities can be engaged. We increase awareness and understanding of community challenges and opportunities and government actions. We identify issues and opportunities across communities and regions. We connect people in groups to create opportunities in communities. We share knowledge and research. We build confidence to speak up and say what communities care about. Many of the issues that we work to tackle require systemic change to address the underlying causes. For example, policies related to affordable housing, social welfare can play a key role in addressing food insecurity and impact people who access food banks. From tackling social, economic, and environmental issues to bringing communities together through arts, sports, and recreation programs, we strive to create positive changes. It is therefore imperative for nonprofits to engage in advocacy and democratic work to create positive impacts that are long-lasting. We serve individuals and nurture communities. We also need to hold accountable the institutions that serve us all. Oh, okay. Oh. That's okay. I guess always an issue with tech. But I did want to highlight that increasing polarization is keeping up our sector at night. Communities are becoming increasingly polarized in ways we've never seen before, and it's keeping nonprofits up at night. Extreme views built on a global ecosystem of misinformation are seeding divisiveness, distrust of institutions, and democratic apathy, while clearing a path for more hate crimes and overt threats to progress on equity from coast to coast to coast. We're noticing that everything is politicized. As nonpartisan advocates, we're forced to choose a side, left or right. We're seeing people being left out of the current economic system and social systems, which is driving the polarization in communities. We're seeing diminishing of good paid jobs, of affordable housing, and we're seeing the blame not being shifted to capitalist systems, but rather newcomers and racialized communities. We have a responsibility to intervene and speak, but we're not able to because we're seeing an increase in demand for services across the province. So today I'm looking forward to our conversation around how nonprofits can play a bigger and stronger role in depolarizing communities and protecting our democracy. Thanks.
Allison.
All right, well, it's a tough act to follow after Stefan and Pamela. My name's Allison Harrell. I'm a co-director of the Consortium on Electoral Democracy, and I'm really, really pleased to be here. And I have this very, very big role of representing the academic perspective. And anyone who knows anything about academia knows that there's not one perspective. We like lots and lots, and we like to argue for years and decades, generations. So what I'm going to do is present some of my reading of the literature and some of the areas that I think are cause for concern, where I see some real risks for electoral democracy in Canada, as well as highlight some areas that I think are exaggerated, where the data doesn't necessarily show what I think the framing around the issues are. And so I'll highlight a few things on those two fronts, and that's kind of the way I'm thinking about this. What are the risks, and where are we maybe overestimating or exaggerating the risks that are out there? And my starting point is really around the concept of polarization. We've heard it I think every speaker has said the word polarization this morning, partly because it was in our description for the session, but also because it's really a concern. I think there's lots of reasons to be concerned about polarization. In the academic literature, I think one of the things that we try and do is distinguish different types of polarization. And I think one of the things that's interesting and important to keep in mind is that when we're talking about polarization, we can talk about polarized viewpoints, people fundamentally disagreeing with each other and getting farther and farther apart. That's not what we're seeing. That's not what we're seeing, at least in the data that we have. And it's not what we're seeing in the US, the place where we think about polarization running rampant. People don't necessarily get farther and farther apart on the issues. Actually, if you look at Republicans and Democrats, they agree on a whole lot of things. They don't like each other, but they agree on a lot of things unless you tell them that that's the other side's viewpoint. And so I think we have to distinguish between more ideologically driven polarization and more affective polarization. And there is evidence that we are seeing effective polarization in the Canadian context, as well as what we call partisan sorting, that attitudes are becoming more predictive of which parties we like. So we're agreeing more with our co-partisans. We're not necessarily getting more extreme. We agree more with them and we dislike the other side more. And those, I think, are two dimensions of polarization that we have a lot of evidence that is present in the Canadian context, perhaps to a lesser extent than our American counterparts, but there is some evidence of this. So I think that's my first point. There is some polarization, but it's a particular type of polarization that has consequences for electoral democracy in Canada. So to put this in perspective, in the 2019 Canadian election study that CDEM conducted with my colleagues, Laura Stevenson, Daniel Rubinson, Peter Lowen, and myself, we asked Canadians if they would be willing to talk to other people about politics. Would they be willing to let us contact them to organize a conversation about politics? About half of Canadians said sure. They said yes, they would be willing to be contacted. And interestingly, in this study, we varied whether or not it was just other Canadians, it was Canadians who agreed with them, or it was Canadians who disagreed with them. When we asked about Canadians who disagreed with them politically, almost half, the same amount as with other Canadians, said they'd be willing to talk about politics. Drops a few percentage points, but it's not a massive drop that you would expect if we were really, really in a highly polarized society where this was structuring every dimension of political life. Another recent study that I found by Eric Merkley reported that between 20 and 25% of Canadians would be somewhat uncomfortable having an outpartisan as a neighbor. So there's some evidence of this, but it's not structuring people's day-to-day lives in the ways that we might think if we listen to the ways in which we talk about polarization in the US or in Canada. I think what's more concerning is how partisan identities can skew how we think about issues. Even in the absence of cues, opinions might not be so different. As I said, we're not seeing necessarily viewpoint polarization. But when partisan identities are attached to positions, people from that side are much more likely to endorse them. And I can give you another example from some of the work that we've done through CDEM. We recently published a study with Canadian election study data where we put partisan cues in information about a political scandal. In this case, it was the blackface scandal. When we put in cues about whose party did the scandal, partisans widely diverged on whether or not that partisan should be held accountable for their actions or not. In the absence of those cues, people looked more like, across the political spectrum, they looked more like one another. They were willing to hold people accountable until they were told that it was their team that had the problem or conducted the scandal. So I think at the heart of electoral democracy, not just democracy, but electoral democracy, what is important is holding elites to account for their actions. Elections are one of the fundamental ways in which we do this. It's an opportunity to judge what the current government's done, and also pick between proposals by various parties. Between elections, citizens, civil society, all sorts of organizations are there to engage in lots of different ways to let elected officials know what issues are important, where they should be concentrating their time. So polarization, if it becomes just a team sport where we're supporting our side no matter what, puts that at risk, that accountability function. And so I think that's something that we should really, really be concerned about. I'm a little less concerned about evidence that trust in political institutions have declined over time, because I think it really matters about what types of institutions we're talking about. As Stefan mentioned, trust in electoral management bodies tends to be very high. There are some cracks that I think we should be watching, but they tend to be very high, and Canadians in general are pretty pleased with the process, the electoral process. They don't necessarily like all the actors involved. They definitely don't like politicians and political elites. But I don't think that's necessarily a problem. I'd much prefer a cynical Canadian electorate than an apathetic one. And so them not liking politicians doesn't concern me. Them thinking that the electoral process is rigged and everybody's cheating, I think is a fundamental risk to electoral democracy. And so I just want to end, if I have 1 minute, on one final point that also is in the description of this talk, So if we have a cynical electorate rather than an apathetic one, or at least some parts of the electorate are more cynical, I think what we should be concerned about are the apathetic ones. So if you recall that experiment, I told you that about half of Canadians were willing to talk to people about politics, regardless if it was somebody that disagreed with them. That leaves half that said they wouldn't be willing to talk about politics. And I think that's the half that actually is more concerning for democracy. So we've seen some declines in political participation over the course of the 20th and now 21st century. Some of that has come back up over recent years. Our low was in 2008. Well, the contemporary low was in 2008. But we've seen that go up. In 2019, participation raised 10 percentage points. And some of the groups that had disassociated with politics the most have slowly in the youngest generations come back up. So I think there are some signs for optimism that engagement in some elections, some of the time, attracts the attention of the Canadian electorate in ways that we want them to. So I think what we should care about are the chronically disengaged and those that do not engage because they think the process is rigged. This, for me, along with polarization, is one of the biggest concerns that I have, that some parts of the population just simply don't care about politics, partly because they have no belief that their voice matters or could make a real difference. If they see no connection between politics and the real challenges they face in their life, there's little reason for them to get involved or to pay attention to what's going on in politics. I think we might be underestimating this group in the types of work that academics do because they're also not taking our surveys. They're not the ones that we're actually capturing. So we might be underestimating the level of apathy and disengagement in this process. So this disconnect between the disengaged as well as problems with polarization and particularly affective polarization to me is dangerous because when things go wrong and politics is impacting their lives, we want people to be willing to engage in peaceful democratic politics. That's what it's for. It's so that we can deal with conflict in ways to hold people accountable and experiment with various options. If the engaged are simply supporting their team and the disengaged aren't paying attention, then it becomes very difficult for elections to serve the role of holding governments accountable. And so for me, that's the frame that I would take in answering the question about what are some of the risks to electoral democracy in Canada.
Thank you, Alison. And I think we actually pick up right from what you're talking about the apathy, because I think, you know, we've seen in recent municipal elections in Ontario, Manitoba, and BC, we've seen voter turnout not only go downward, but actually plummet off a cliff in many cases. So when we talk about record low political participation, and maybe I'll start with Stefan on this one. What do you think is driving that? Or are you gonna punt this over to Alice?
Probably will punt it over. I mean, there are many, we know that there are many factors involved. And as an electoral management body, we cannot influence all those factors. Motivational factors are beyond our reach. We should be careful not to go there. We do know that there are information barriers to electors, so that's something we can play on. We work with civil society to share information, so we have a role to play. But it's a complex phenomenon. I'm sure you'll.
Yeah, Alice, what can change that?
So I think that the narrative that we're at all-time lows of participation is not necessarily fully true because you see ebbs and flows. And if you look at the last few elections, we're at levels of the 1990s right now federally. And so there are concerns that certain groups are not being socialized into the political process. And I think the decline that we saw leading up to 2008 it's concerning when you have a particularly young, less educated electors who don't engage, because they're probably not ever going to engage, and that's a problem. But what happens is that you have minority governments after minority governments, and during that time, what you see is everybody just gets tired of voting every 2 years. And then we get into a 4-year election cycle, and suddenly participation goes up. So my slightly optimistic view is that Canadians are kind of paying attention. They do come back to the polls often when there are issues and they think there's time for change and there's possibility for change. And so I'd be a little hesitant to say that we're in this like long-term decline of participation because I see people participating in all sorts of ways.
So are we talking, and Pamela, I really want to get to you on this because I think with different groups, you can really speak to that. But are we talking, just to be clear, federally, or you're talking provincially and municipally?
So the data I'm referencing is federal data. I think one concern I have is that other levels are not being seen as important. And so when you see declines, you see those declines there first.
Right.
Because people are paying attention, they're making decisions about where to spend their time and energy. And some of the levels that have the most direct contact with our everyday lives, people just aren't focusing on them. And I think that's an issue because a lot of our levels are local and municipal.
So in your opinion, it's not the new normal, it's the ebbs and flows that we're seeing that will continue.
At least in the last 25 years.
Okay, fair. Pamela.
Yeah, a couple of threads I want to pick up on. One is something that Allison shared just in her opening statement. I think we're also talking about polarization between voters, right? Either people think the system is rigged, or there's people on the other end who don't think the system works for them and are left out. So apart from the data, what we're sort of seeing on the grounds when we're interacting with communities, and by communities, I mean, we're serving folks at the margins of communities. These are people accessing food banks, accessing mental health and addictions programming, people that are constantly left out the system. The system isn't built for them, right? So when we have governments, when we have lots of promises made, and those promises either don't speak to the communities on the ground or don't realize that, I think impacts apathy, right? Childcare, I think, is a really, really great example right now, particularly if we're talking about the federal level. 50 years of advocacy for a national childcare system. We finally got it in. We finally have all the investments, but folks aren't seeing the $10 a day childcare yet, right? Or it's very slowly coming into play. Is it going to come into play right before the election? We don't know, but that's gonna, that drives that'll drive apathy. Well, hey, I wanted childcare and they said we are going to get childcare, and now we haven't gotten childcare. So what's the point of voting? Right. And when we see folks come into communities or come into community agencies, they're kind of like, hey, I need to access food, or I need a place to stay tonight, or, I'm facing this addiction and I need support around this. How are you to talk about housing policy? How do you talk about food insecurity in that space? Right. Yeah, I'll pause there.
And I'm also interested because you work with a lot of immigrant communities, and we've done some reporting recently on allegations of foreign interference, for example, or you have people who are coming from countries that don't have these type of democracies or have so much distrust for the whole process. Is that also kind of a concern?
Not so much as a concern. I think that's where the education piece comes up, right? So one of the roles I forgot to highlight actually is that, we definitely do a lot of get out the vote campaigns. Agencies will set up voting, they'll set up mayoral debates. I think the last mayoral debate was organized by nonprofits actually. We'll sort of look at all the candidates in an area and share, this is what their stance is on XYZ resources or XYZ issues, and we'll share that out with communities. But I think the issue becomes we don't have time to do all that really important work because people are in crises, right? People just need a place to stay. People just need food, or people just need some support with family. So it gets hard to do that education work that is so, so vital to what you were sharing. Yeah.
Did you want to say something, Stefan? No. Okay. Okay. Allison, I'm curious about the polarization, because you were talking about the data of the of what you're seeing and what we're thinking is happening and what's hyperbole and that sort of thing. What more research needs to be done to be able to understand that issue better? Because you're right, we there are some markers that show that we're more polarized and more entrenched, and I think distrust for the news is one of them. But what other research needs to be done in this vein?
So I think there's actually a ton of research going on in this area, in the Canadian context, but also comparatively. And so a lot of that is trying to tease out what phenomenons are happening and what isn't happening. And so I think that's what I was trying to bring to my remarks, is that there are different aspects, and focusing in on what's actually changing, and I think it's more the affective component of it, allows us to think about the types of interventions that can reduce it. And so I think some of the most exciting research right now is looking at what can you do to get people to not just defend their camp, but to listen, to go back to John's opening remark, listen to the other side, be willing to accept information from news sources that people perceive as partisan. I think, and that's where I think some of the most exciting research is happening, not conclusively yet, but a lot of times it's getting people to actually sit down with somebody from the other side and think about it. And the other thing, and I think this is an area we have less research in, I think political elites have a huge role to play here. They're the ones who have to say, this is a safe and secure process. We might not like the outcomes, but Elections Canada, Elections BC, Elections Ontario, they're doing what they need to do. And the process is fair. And we'll do a better job next time of convincing you. And I think that's where we see cracks in the elite discourse. And that's really dangerous because people look to their elites for cues, especially in an effectively polarized context.
That's a very good point. Stefan, you spoke about how it was with Elections Canada, Elections Ontario. I mean, this was trust that was just kind of given, but now you have to earn that trust. Talk to me a bit more about that.
Yeah, I think when I arrived at Elections Canada in 2007, we didn't talk about trust a whole lot more, and we didn't do any efforts to explain why the process was a process that they could trust. What were the safeguards that are in place? We just assumed that people also assumed that they could trust the process. It was all implicit, just like driving your car. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think we do have to be make efforts to explain to Canadians why the system works, how it works, what are the safeguards in place, because they're hearing all kinds of things. And it's not enough to say it's not true. Trust us. We have to demonstrate that.
And I mean, we don't have an election right around the corner like the Americans do, or maybe we do. Who knows? But what are you thinking, and what are your concerns going into the next election?
Always many concerns. I mean, we saw some tensions in the last election in the context of the pandemic that translated to some physical tensions at the polls, which we'd never seen before. That was shocking to me. We had over 100 cases of police intervention at the polls in the last federal election. Now, if you're looking at over close to 16,000 polls, that's a small number, and there were a few cases of actual physical violence. But there's a tone, there's an anger that's out there that we haven't seen before, and that is concerning. There's something fascinating for me, and it still is the case whenever I go to a poll. I don't vote, but I go to polls often. Is this sense of, in French, la sérénité, serenity about the process? You walk into a place, and in our system, apart from a few writings, that the majority of people in that polling place don't vote your way. And yet everybody is very polite and civil about it, and almost a religious experience. And that's something that's fascinating for me. And we really have to preserve that.
It's funny. I've covered elections here and in the States, and it's such a different vibe, and especially more recently in the United States, when you go into, the protests that we've seen, the images you've seen on the news of, the counting, and then the pressure that a lot of these volunteer election workers are under that they're not under now. Is that a concern to you going forward? Like, is that something that you're looking at, or do you think that's a United States problem and here we're a lot better off?
Well, certainly we are better off, fortunately, but I don't think we can take that for granted. I think there were a lot of tensions around the pandemic, and we'll see how that evolves post-pandemic. But I'm not taking it for granted that there won't be any tensions. That's part of the polarization. But I was somewhat reassured, but what we learned this morning, not entirely, but somewhat reassured.
Yeah. I'm curious from you, Pamela, what do you want to learn from other sectors? I mean, when you're in the nonprofit space, what can other sectors do to help you do your job more effectively?
I was thinking about the research question, if we need more research, but I actually don't think we need any more research. I think we know what the issues are. It's just a matter of sort of advocating and implementing them. I think cross-sectoral support on issues would be really, really helpful. Oftentimes it feels like we're the lone wolf sort of going in and advocating for communities that can't advocate for themselves, right? Or advocating on issues that seem like only impact a very small percentage of folks, but really important nonetheless, right? So I think getting cross-sectoral support around that would be really helpful. We're not the only ones saying, transform the social safety net. And kind of also going back to what you were saying, Allison, around we agree on a lot of the issues, across the board. I think where there's a lot of disagreement in is how do we solve these big public policy issues? How do we solve these big social issues that we're facing, right? And of course, everyone has their individual way of thinking about that. But for us, it is nonpartisan. It is really thinking about those folks that are at the margins. And I think just backing up a little bit is also distinguishing between trust in the electoral process versus trust in democracy versus trust in elected officials, right? It's very different. You can believe in the electoral process and trust that, but you may not trust the outcomes in terms of, are those promises going to be realized? Are these promises going to make a material difference in my life as an individual voter? And I think those three pieces are really important to pick up on as well. Yeah.
I could keep this going for another hour, but I think we're out of time. Oh, we have a few more minutes. Excellent, excellent. So then on that note, how long do I have? Okay. Maybe I'll get you all then to explore the idea of trust, because that is the theme for this summit, and it's obviously so important to all of us because we're here. So through that vein, through that idea of trust, how do we earn it? How do we keep it? What do we need to do at this very moment to keep our healthy democracy? And Stefan, I'll start with you.
Well, that's right. I don't think there's a magic solution. I think there's a constellation of strategies we have to bring together. I think we have to work with civil society. I think civil society organizations bring a trusted anchor point from which we can have the conversations. We provide them with tools and information, and they can work with us. But we also need the academics to better understand the phenomenon that we're seeing. So I think it's really a collaborative effort.
And what about you, Pamela? Any final words or anything you want to say about the idea of trust and from your vantage point?
I agree. Definitely it's collaborative. Definitely is a long-term game, long-term solutions. I think with us as a sector, we have trust. Where trust is sort of diminishing is that we just can't engage in communities, right? Like the public policy issues seem so big and large, and nothing seems to be changing for communities at the margins. That's demoralizing, and that's where we're seeing it diminish.
So you said to me, and I don't know if it was right now or we talked before about this, but like just the get out the vote idea, it's not sufficient anymore.
No, get out the vote is not sufficient anymore. And we actually have some interesting models happening in community where we're trying to do peer-to-peer work. So there's multiple agencies, particularly in Toronto through the Toronto neighborhood centers, who are working with their frontline workers, building public policy advocacy skill sets, and helping them engage with others, their peers in communities, or working with community leaders, right? And just educating them in terms of what the electoral process is, how to engage, why engagement matters. And that peer-to-peer, local, grassroots, community level trust building is what we need to invest in.
Okay, that's interesting. Allison, what about you? Trust? How do we do it? I know there's no magic bullet, but
Yeah, so I guess I would raise two possible points. One is that, I think Stefan referred to this in his opening remarks, people who have contact with solid public service and a good state and the policies that are being offered are being delivered, I think that helps build trust in the system. And I think that's something Canada has historically done fairly well in some sectors. We have some recent data that shows that people who have had contact in the last 12 months with the government agency tend to be happier with democracy in Canada, for example. And so that contact can be a good thing. The other thing I would say is I think political elites have to not drink the Kool-Aid and look at short-term gains for votes to rally their camp that actually have detrimental effects on the norms that have been in place in Canada and supported the system for a long time. And that's one area where I feel like we've allowed political elites to play with those norms because there are advantages electorally short term, but long term, I think there are really serious costs.
is there any examples you can provide?
So I think any hints of issues in counting of ballots, of electoral management bodies not doing their jobs, I think we need to hold these agencies accountable, obviously. But I think the risk when it comes from political elites that use it as an electoral issue makes people think that the system is rigged rather than there are issues that we need to address across parties. And so the Alberta election recently, there were questions, we were talking about this in the beginning, about the independence of the electoral management body in Alberta because of a publicity that they had out about encouraging voters to be registered ahead of time, which gave the impression that you couldn't register at the polls. Or at least that's how it was interpreted by certain people. And so there was a debate around this, a healthy debate. But in the context of an election campaign where it becomes partisan, then those people who identify with their team start seeing the process as rigged against them. I think that's a really problematic aspect for trust in our electoral democracy.
And you said a term, Pamela, before. You said WhatsApp University. You know, it's so true, because that's how this information gets disseminated, and then people believe it, and this rise of disinformation, misinformation. Alison, curious from you though, as we look toward the next election. I know I asked that of Stefan, but you and Pamela, I'm curious about this. What are your top concerns when we look at future elections?
I have so many. So I think what will be interesting is to see what happens after a long liberal government. And what we tend to see is that there's an opportunity for change and it mobilizes people. But in the current context, I worry that the tone and the ways in which the election campaign takes place might accentuate some of this hostility between different political camps that percolates down to the electorate. And I think that's dangerous for lots of reasons, because we know when we're really ingrained in our political identities, we tend to interpret information in a way that confirms what we think already. And we're less willing to listen to the other side. And I think that's dangerous. And I think it comes often from political elites and sort of playing strategically with norms that we really want in place.
Telling me nodding.
I was thinking about our concerns as a sector. I think we're concerned with, you know, who's going to present a platform or ideas or carry, you know, carry communities into this post-pandemic reality that we live in, right? Like what kind of solutions are they going to pose for climate change and our social safety net, depolarization, what language is going to be used, what tone is going to be used, sort of building on that. And you know, are people going to do a lot of strategic voting pieces as well? Like, that's of concern too. Are we really going to get to engage in policy and engage in issues, or is it going to be, you know, we have to make sure this person doesn't get elected or this person doesn't get elected, so we'll just do strategic voting, because that's detriment to democracy as well.
Yeah, I know we're at 10:10, but Stefan, maybe you could leave us with some hope,
Yes.
some positivity for our last. I sort of put his pressure on you, but
I was just about to do that. A couple of points. The first one is that we monitor social media during an election, and we see all kinds of negative narratives. The election is rigged, all kinds of stories. They do not reflect the mainstream conversations. When you do surveys at a broader scale, it's not the same narratives that you see. So you got to be careful not to be completely absorbed by the dark side of social media and think that it's a reflection of what's happening out there. I think my examples that I gave of the polling locations are reflective of that. You see instances where people are tense and angry, but the vast majority are extraordinarily peaceful and happy to participate in the process. I think we still have some very good fundamentals in this country.
that's great. That's great. That's a great way to end off. Thank you all so much for your perspectives. It's been a real pleasure moderating this discussion. And thank you all for your engagement.
All right. So part of my job is to keep us on track. And we've gone a few moments over, but you do have 10 minutes to make your way to your next session. You can grab a cup of coffee. Go ahead. I also want to just clarify that lunch is actually at 12:30, not at 11:20, as it shows in maybe the program. You might have noticed we flipped the break. There'll be a break at 11:20, not lunch. And just want to again thank the sessions here. And one key takeaway is that people who vote and who participate in the system, their trust in the system goes up. And I think that gives us a leverage point in to building trust in our system. So thank you.